This new NBA social media trend is absolutely killing me. This whole "we done with the 90s" thing is honestly one of the worst things to happen to basketball this year. So if you're not hip on it, the idea behind it is that you've got guys on NBA social media going back, picking some of the worst lowlights of the 90s era and using that to make this blanket statement that that particular era was overrated. The most popular thing now is the whole Michael Jordan had no left hand thing, which I think is 100% exaggerated, but it's actually pretty funny. I even heard someone say he's just Jaylen Brown with aura, and I have been laughing at that over the last few days after seeing it on TikTok. So half of me, when I first saw how much of a trend it became, thought that people were just trolling. But the more I read comment sections and things like that, I realize people are being dead serious. People legitimately think that the superstars of not only the 90s, but also the 80s and even the 70s were overrated. And then there's this notion that if some guys played in today's game, they wouldn't be as effective. And that is just ridiculous to me. And to be honest, it's no different than the narrative that the old heads were pushing years back when LeBron and Jordan comparisons started heating up. What did the OG start saying? They said stuff like, if LeBron or so-and-so played in the 90s, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the physicality and they wouldn't be as good. And it created these ridiculous narratives that made it hard for people to appreciate the greatness that we were getting in the modern era. Young fans couldn't enjoy the game without hearing some former player on ESPN talk about how much harder their era was and how guys today couldn't hang back then. And so now the young guys are pushing back and saying that the 90s were actually the quote-unquote trash era and that most of those guys wouldn't be able to play today. And look, if it's just trolling to push back on the OG fans, then fine, I can kind of get with that. But the thing is, a lot of it isn't trolling. A lot of people are dead serious with these arguments. And it just creates this culture that I think is ruining sports, and it's been ruining basketball in particular for almost a decade. It seems like a lot of fans can't appreciate one thing without downing the other, and it does not have to be that way. Why does the enjoyment and even preference of one era of NBA basketball have to come at the expense of the other? And that's a direct result of comparison culture. When LeBron was winning his rings in Miami, it ushered in this whole thing where everything he did on the court was compared to Jordan. Hell, that whole thing started even before he was winning his rings, back when he was in Cleveland. We couldn't fully enjoy LeBron's time in Miami because most of the time was spent by the media comparing him to Jordan. Comparison culture ruined the true appreciation for the sport, and we're seeing it now with this new trend. To argue that the 90s era of basketball was overrated and the peak players at that time couldn't do X, Y, Z in the league today is ridiculous to me. Yes, the style of play was different. There was less spacing, and maybe all 15 total guys in a roster weren't as talented relative to this era. And it is true that this current era recognized more nuances in the game that they took advantage of, and that could lead to higher scoring and things like that we're seeing today. But that happens with literally anything. As time moves on, things evolve. People get more advanced, period. But does that mean we have to disrespect those who came before us for working with what they had in their time? So to down the accomplishments of the players of previous eras is whack as hell to me. And also this, if we're going to be fair, if we were to hypothetically drop the players of the 90s into this era, you'd have to give them the same training, same resources, all of those things as the guys of this era. So if we take that into context, how could we truly argue that those guys wouldn't still kill in the league today? It doesn't make the least bit of sense to me. And I'm going to reiterate, it's no different and no better than when the old head fans do it when talking down on this generation. And look, multiple things can be true at once. Yes, the guys in the 90s probably weren't as crafty and collectively as skilled as the guys now, but at the same time, the guys in the 90s really actually did play a game where more physicality was allowed by refs, and there was a different sense of pride from the players in that era as well. So each era had its own advantages. Does that mean one era was definitively better than the other? No. In context for what was allowed through each time period through the history of the NBA, you have to appreciate what the players did. It's the same with hip hop, and this may be a wild comparison, but take a ride with me. You may prefer one era over the other, but to insult the eras that you didn't prefer, to me, makes me question how much of a hip hop fan you truly are. And the same thing holds true with the NBA. I do question how much of a true basketball fan you are if you're disrespecting eras just to big up your favorite era, whether you're a younger fan or not. Y'all don't do it with college basketball. Players are much less skilled, and when you tune in, you know you're watching a level of basketball that's lower than the peak level that we see with the NBA. But y'all don't go around saying college basketball players are whack because comparison culture isn't as much of a thing with college hoops as it is with the NBA. NBA fans are the ones driving comparison culture, and it has to stop. There's something to love and take from each era of hoops. And if you really sit and study what some of the best from each era did in context of their era and what was allowed, you'd be pretty impressed. So let's put away that whole "we done with the 90s" era, and for NBA fans in general, let's stop with comparison culture. Because if we're being 110% honest, it has done nothing to make the sport of basketball any better.